In 80 Days, adventurer and award-winning filmmaker Paul G. Roberts retraces the global footsteps of Phileas Fogg, hero of Jules Verne's most famous work.
This is the story of, or the journey story, from Siena to Rome. From Siena, you're going by train to Rome. It's your best bet because Siena's, as I said earlier, has got really restricted parking. They don't like people from the modern world invading their little, medieval sanctuary. And Rome's crazy traffic and inability to park anywhere, you really just don't want to be laboured with having an automobile for the journey and also when you get to Rome because you won't need it. Like for me, I stay in the centre of Rome. The historical part, and I really have no reason to go out. You can always rent a car, or as I prefer to do for the authentic Roman holiday experience, is rent a Vespa. You can even rent, electronic Vespas, EVs, these days if you want to do your bit to save the planet. Now the train makes it easy to cover. It's only 145 miles, although it's not a direct route because Siena is off the main grid. And what you have to do is go back into Florence to catch the fast trains. There are 36 Trenitalia trains that depart Siena each day that will get you to the Roma Termini station. And some of the Alta Velocità, the high-speed ones, or the others are the Regionale trains, which aren't quite as fast and make more stops along the way. But you get to see more of the countryside. And you'll need to change trains at some point, usually in Firenze. But it's a quick train and there's lots of versions. So, or you can take a regional train from Siena to Chiusi-Chianciano Terme, and then another regional train from Chiusi to Rome. They're cheaper, they take longer, there's more stops, and the trains are a little bit shabbier. So I would recommend, like I do, go to Florence, then get your connection. And once you get to Firenze Santa Maria Novella, you can take an Italo train to the Roma Termini or Roma Termini. The Trenitalia Regionale train from Siena to Florence takes about an hour and a half, and then the Italo train from Florence to Rome takes just another 1.5 hours. You know this city. There's nowhere else on the planet like it. It's said that all roads lead to Rome. It's the eternal city. It's the city of dreams, of the Colosseum, of gladiators, of the Caesars. It was the cradle of the greatest civilization, the greatest empire the world had ever seen up until that point. It's Rome, and this is the history of Rome. From law and politics to architecture to civil engineering, from literature to the arts to the very languages we speak today, the Roman Empire's echoes continue to be heard. It's a place where I've always felt moved whenever I've been there. You're literally walking through the past, centuries of history. Whether you've studied Latin or the Bible, or just happened to watch the odd, gladiator film, Rome echoes in eternity, just like Maximus said. The things that you do in this life echo in eternity.
First, what we do in life echoes in eternity.
And that's exactly what Rome does, to me at least. The foundation begins in the Latin city of Alba Longa. There, the twin newborn sons of the god of war Mars and a priestess who was sentenced to death by their great uncle. But Romulus and Remus were saved by a she-wolf and raised by a poor shepherd. Now, is that a great origin story or what? As young men, Romulus and Remus set out to establish their own city. But Remus was murdered by his brother in a dispute about its location. As king, Romulus declared Rome an asylum city, very quickly attracted all sorts of unsavory characters from across the Italian peninsula. And what happened next would echo through Rome's history. The mysterious or violent death of the ruler. First, it was the Sabine king, Titus Tatius, who died during a riot. Then Romulus himself disappeared during a storm. In the myth, he became a god, Quirinus, and left this earthly realm. But realistically, he was most likely killed by a political rival. And during the reign of the second king, Numa Pompilius, key Roman elements appeared, including the 12-month calendar, Vestal virgins, and the position of Pontifex, which is now a priest. Numa was overthrown by 5 other kings, the last of whom was called Tarquin the Proud. Not only murdered his predecessor, but he was overthrown by the people. Thus was the Free Republic of Rome born in the 6th century BC. Now, only a handful of aristocratic families, known as the patricians, back then held political and religious power. The plebeians, who made up the majority of Rome's population, i.e. plebs, were excluded. However, between 494 and 287 BC, protests about laws and change, including the formation of the Concilium Plebis, dedicated tribunes in the 12 tables of written laws. Progress was slow, but eventually the wealthy plebeians, or equestrian class, came to have the same rights as the patricians. However, many changes were only surface deep, and nothing changed for the poor, the same as today basically. In the years that followed, the Republic was in almost a constant state of war, as it tried to bring all of Italy under its banner. By 130 BC, Rome was a Mediterranean superpower, having expanded into North Africa and Spain. Following the Punic Wars of Carthage. The consul Marius reformed the military. By 102 BC, soldiers were paid for their service and given farms upon retirement. Wealthy men used their money to create loyal private armies. Corruption and greed in Rome led to civil wars starting in 88 BC, when Marius's rival, General Sulla, marched his army into Rome. Sulla eventually won and became a consul. Now, Julius Caesar, in 49 BC, Rome braced for civil war again, as General Julius Caesar, who was the hero of Gaul, crossed the Rubicon River into Italy with his army. And he was about to face off against both the Senate and his former friend and partner, Pompey. Pompey mounted an unsuccessful military campaign, and he was assassinated by the orders of Pharaoh Ptolemy VIII, who hoped to win favour from Caesar, but instead a fateful meeting between Ptolemy's sister Cleopatra and Caesar led to a famous love affair and the Pharaoh's death.
Princess Cleopatrassa, daughter of the two Rams, mistress of Sedge and Bee.
Back in Rome, meanwhile, Caesar's merciful treatment of his opponents had only increased his heroic status. The Senate declared him an absolute ruler for 10 years, but Caesar overextended his powers and he made himself dictator for life in 44 BC. And doing so, he effectively signed his own death warrant. On the Ides of March, he was stabbed to death by some 40 senators on the floor of the government building. You remember the Shakespeare line, "Et tu, Brutus." Now, the liberators of the Republic faced the wrath of the Romans. Civil war eventually erupted again, and this time involving Caesar's trusted friend, General Mark Antony. Mark Antony's lover, Cleopatra, and Caesar's nephew and heir, Octavian. Octavian emerged victorious with the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra, and Egypt, with its vital grain harvest, came under Rome's control. It was the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. Now, Octavian renamed himself Augustus, and he was declared Emperor, son of God Caesar, in 27 BC. As the sole ruler, Augustus maintained at least an illusion that the Republic still remained. While the Senate was still important, its real purpose was to give legitimacy to the emperor's decisions. Augustus's 41-year-long rule was a golden age. Peace reigned, and there was prosperity and stability, and the culture flourished. Augustus developed a road network and courier system. He established both the standing army and the Praetorian Guard, dedicated police and firefighting services in the city of Rome. He also embarked upon a great rebuilding project for the city. The empire enlarged dramatically, stretching into Europe, and the conquest of Spain was completed. Losing 3 legions in Germania in 9 AD, however, brought an end to the Rome's expansion into that province. Now, when Augustus died in 14 AD, his stepson Tiberius succeeded him. He was a competent but disinterested ruler. Instead, he delegated power to Sejanus, the ambitious commander of the Praetorian Guard. After Sejanus had Tiberius' heirs murdered, the emperor went on a paranoia-fueled killing spree, convinced he was surrounded by his enemies, and ironically, he may have been killed by a successor, Caligula, in 37 AD. Although Caligula was popular at first, his true nature soon emerged, and over the space of a 4-year rule, he declared himself a living god. He executed many people, including family members, and embarked upon an incestuous liaisons with all of his sisters. The Praetorian Guard murdered him and appointed his uncle Claudius in his place. Now, Claudius never expected to be emperor. Various physical challenges meant he had lived as a scholar away from public view. And despite his lack of experience, Claudius was a good administrator and ordered the building of many roads, aqueducts and canals across the empire. And during his 13-year reign, the successful conquest of Britain began. In 54 AD, he died, possibly at the hands of his 4th wife, making way for her son, Nero, to ascend the throne. And everybody knows the story about how Nero fiddled while Rome burned. He blamed the devastating Great Fire of 64 AD on the Christians, who to him were a troublesome sect. The fire distracted the public from the empire's empty coffers due to his overspending, and Nero was widely despised and routinely dispatched all of his opponents. Eventually, the army and Praetorian Guard mutinied, and the Senate declared him an enemy of Rome, leading to his suicide in 68 AD. Nero left no heir. Over the following year, 4 men vied for the throne, and it was the 4th, a general from the equestrian class called Vespasian, who triumphed in 69 AD. Vespasian worked hard during his 10-year reign, restoring the empire's financial treasures, erecting many important buildings, including the symbol of Rome itself, the mighty Colosseum. The looted treasures of the temple in Jerusalem bankrolled much of this work. Vespasian had been the governor of Judea before becoming emperor, and his son Titus made a name for himself by putting down the Jewish resistance in that province. Titus governed for only 2 years before his brother succeeded him in 81 AD. Domitian had an autocratic streak, but seemed to have the support of both the public and the military. Rome prospered under him during his 15-year rule, but he got on the wrong side of court officials, who again had him murdered. The 2nd century AD was an era of relative stability under the Nerva Antonine emperors. Unusually, they were mostly adopted by their predecessors rather than being biological heirs. They included men such as Trajan, a charismatic military commander who expanded the empire from the Caspian Sea all the way to Scotland. Hadrian, whose famous wall formed a bulwark against marauding Scottish tribes in Britannia, and the philosopher warrior Marcus Aurelius, who I'm sure you all know. His son Commodus was an incompetent egomaniac who fancied himself a gladiator. He was strangled by his trainer on the orders of the Praetorian Guard in 192 AD. Now, Commodus's death was the opening act in a century-long period known as the Imperial Crisis. 29 emperors came to power through plots and violent death over just 5 decades. In 284 AD, Diocletian, a former soldier, sought to end the chaos. He split the empire in two. He ruled the eastern portion, which was mainly Greek, and his friend Maximian, the western part, which was largely Latin. There were senior emperors with the title of Augustus, and each half was further divided and governed by junior emperors or Caesars. This tetrarchy, or rule of 4, only lasted about 30 years, but it created peace and stability. Christians did not fare well under the new regime as they refused to worship Diocletian, who had styled himself on the embodiment of Jupiter on earth, churches were torn down, sacred writings burned, and followers were persecuted. Paradoxically, this only made Christianity stronger and ultimately led to the abdication of both Diocletian and Maximian in 305 AD. Infighting over who would legally succeed them ensued. Constantine, the son of former Western Caesar, emerged victoriously. Once the ruler of the Western Empire, Constantine legalized Christianity, claiming that Christ had led him to victory over his rivals. However, he made sure not to alienate those who still followed the old religions. In the East, his counterpart, Licinius, had persecuted the sizable Christian minority out of fears that they would rise up in support of Constantine. In 324 AD, Constantine and Licinius clashed in Byzantium. Constantine's win saw East and West united under one ruler, and in the years that closely followed, Christianity flourished and many of the less savoury practices of the past were banned, such as ritual sacrifices, gladiatorial games, and crucifixion as a form of execution. In just 6 short years, a magnificent new Roman capital was established in the ancient city of Byzantium. New Rome, as it was known during Constantine's life, lay between the eastern and western edges of the empire on important trade routes. Eventually renamed Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, it attracted people from across the empire in search of a better life. In time, the empire was split into east and west again. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell after years of fending off the military and political intrigues of barbarian interlopers. The Eastern Empire continued on as the Byzantine Empire, finally collapsing under the might of the Ottoman Turks in 1453. After almost a millennium, the Roman Empire had come to an end.